Well, good afternoon, everybody. This workshop, like the movie with Marty McFly and Doc Brown, is meant to take us back to the future. My name is David Reamer. I'm a senior fellow at the Community Advocates Public Policy Institute in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And also thanks to Nancy Altman, a senior advisor on workforce issues at Social Security Works. And I'm very pleased to be joined by two expert co-hosts. Dr. June Hopkins is a distinguished historian and professor emerita at Georgia Southern University's Armstrong campus. She's the author of Harry Hopkins, Sudden Hero, Brash Reformer, and other books and scholarly works. June is also a new member of the Academy. Indi Dattagupta is co-executive director of the Project on Deep Poverty at the Georgetown Center on Poverty and Inequality, part of the Georgetown University Law School. He's a member of the board of the Academy and a widely respected advocate in DC and elsewhere of evidence-based policies for reducing poverty. Let's begin by dialing the clock back 78 years. When Franklin Roosevelt took over as president in 1933, at least 25% of US adults were unemployed. In his inaugural address, FDR said, "Our greatest primary task is to put people to work." The New Deal quickly launched several major subsidized employment programs, including the Civilian Conservation Corps, the CCC, the Civil Works Administration, the CWA, and the Works Progress Administration, the WPA. Harry Hopkins, the grandfather of June Hopkins, designed and ran the last two of those. This workshop will address three questions that the past illuminates, but the future must tackle. The first question, do we face again a large shortage of jobs? Second question, if so, what do the New Deal's jobs programs tell us about the design, the operation and financing, and the effectiveness of subsidized employment today? And improving on the New Deal's record, how can we make sure that the 21st century subsidized employment programs, if we have them, will not shortchange Blacks, Hispanics, and women, but will actually promote greater equality? June Hopkins will concentrate on these questions. And then the third question is, in the decades since the New Deal, what have we learned from contemporary, smaller scale, subsidized employment programs? Have they produced positive results? And is Congress looking to greatly expand them as at least one way to deal with a shortage of jobs as the economy recovers? Indi Dattagupta will address these questions. We'll wrap up with an open discussion of what strategies and arguments are most likely to persuade the public, press, think tanks, academicians, and federal policymakers to support and enact subsidized employment legislation. I'm going to share my screen here and bring up a PowerPoint. Let's see here, get this to work. Here we go. So our topic is the Civilian Conservation Corps to today, the role of subsidized employment in achieving economic security. The BLS data that you see here show that there's almost always a job shortage. When Franklin Roosevelt and Harry Hopkins, Francis Perkins, Henry Wallace, Harold Ickes, and the other New Dealers got down to work in 1933, they had no trouble recognizing that the giant job shortage that existed then, even though collecting unemployment data was in its infancy and job opening data were unborn. But today we have solid survey data on both the number of job seekers and the number of job openings. For decades, the BLS has collected data on the unemployed using different definitions, and the top four lines, black, green, purple, and red, show different definitions of who's unemployed that are explained at the bottom. Since 2000, however, it's only been since then that BLS has been collecting data on job openings. But when you compare them, we can see if and when a job shortage exists, and we can measure its magnitude. And sure enough, as this slide shows, for the last 2 decades, there have been more job seekers than job vacancies most of the time, no matter how you define job seekers. So a job shortage in the United States is actually the norm. Sometimes it's modest, often it's big. Today, if you can see on the far right, It's huge. Private industry can rarely absorb all job seekers. The New Deal's jobs programs, to steal a bit of June Hopkins' thunder, were fairly effective in reducing the number of unemployed. This isn't the conventional wisdom, and that was because the early BLS measures of unemployed treated the workers in New Deal jobs programs as unemployed, not employees. So the official unemployment rate in 1933, and for many years thereafter, which is the blue line, remained artificially high. But in fact, the men and women who were working in New Deal jobs programs were clearly employed. They often performed tough physical labor, often outdoors, in both fair and foul weather. And if you count them as employed, the true unemployment rate from 1933 to 1937 dropped sharply, as shown in the red line, well before the United States beefed up its military spending in 1939 and then entered World War II. So could programs that resemble the New Deal's jobs programs be proposed today? Well, the answer is fairly simple. As Indy will explain, they already have been proposed. One example that's highlighted here is the Jobs for Economic Recovery Act, which introduced in the last Congress by Senator Ron Wyden, now the chair of Senate Finance, together with Senators Tammy Baldwin, Chris Van Hollen, Michael Bennet, and Cory Booker, as well as in the House by Congressman Danny Davis and Congresswoman Gwen Moore. So let's now return again to the 1930s and ask June Hopkins to tell us about the structure and the effectiveness of the New Deal's subsidized employment programs, focusing in particular on the CCC, the CWA, and the WPA. And then after June, we'll hear from Indy about the effectiveness of contemporary programs and the range of subsidized proposals that Congress is looking at. So I'm now gonna get off of my sharing the PowerPoint and turn it over to June.
Okay, thank you, David. I'm going to do my share screen now and see if I can do this. And get into the okay, in May of 1933, going back to the future again, in the midst of the Great Depression, when unemployment was as high as 25%, President Franklin Roosevelt named Harry Hopkins as Federal Relief Administrator. He told him two things: give immediate and adequate relief to the unemployed and pay no attention to politics or politicians. At this time, the vast army of unemployed were desperately looking for work. 600,000 families had lost their homes. Many more had lost their life savings when the bank failed. With a congressional allocation of $500 million, FDR put Hopkins in charge of the Federal Emergency Relief Administration, the FERA. On May 21st, 1933, the FERA assumed responsibility for 18 million people, representing 4 million families on relief. Hopkins got to work, cut through red tape, and within 2 hours had spent $5 million. Money first went to direct relief, cash to those most needy. Then, realizing that people wanted the dignity of working for a wage rather than a government handout, Hopkins initiated the Work Relief Projects. FERA paid workers on the basis of an estimated budgetary deficiency. At the same time, FDR created the Civilian Conservation Corps, a work relief and conservation program. The program used federal funds to hire young unemployed men to repair and improve America's environment while living in camps across the nation. The camps were administered by the US military. This was the only institution large enough to undertake such a project. The CCC men, called the Tree Army, were paid $35 a month and sent $25 back to their families. They planted more than 3 billion trees, constructed trails and shelters in more than 800 parks nationwide. During its 9 years of existence, it helped to shape the modern national and state park system and employed 9 million young men. CCC jobs were also meant to take these young men off the job market in order to make jobs in private industry more available to heads of household. The FERA and the CCC represented the innovative idea that the federal government has a responsibility to ensure the welfare of all citizens. The FVRA demonstrated that jobs are the solution to poverty and that people want the dignity of working for a living rather than a dole. The CCC reflected President Roosevelt's concern for preserving America's environment, and this could be the focus of a reimagined CCC today. While these two programs did employ a lot of needy Americans, these jobs could not absorb all the unemployed, and women and people of color were not prioritized. Any new government subsidized job program must address this issue and ensure racial and gender equality. Anticipating a dangerously cold winter ahead, Hopkins presented the president with an idea. Consequently, on November 9th, 1933, FDR signed an executive order creating the Temporary Civil Works Administration, the CWA, using $400 million of FVRA funds and $350 million from Harold Ickes' PWA. Hopkins again worked fast, cut through red tape, and on November 20th, transferred all relievers to CWA roles. CWA jobs paid the prevailing wage. There was no means test. Anyone could apply for a CWA job. Within 4 weeks, the program had put to work 4 million people and became the nation's largest employer. Meant to be temporary, it ended in the spring of 1934. Workers were folded back into FVRA direct or work relief. In early spring of 1934, more than 11 million workers were still unemployed and on relief rolls. 80% of these were employable and more work needed to be done. Even though it was short-lived, the CWA stands as the best model for what FDR promised in his inauguration speech. Action and action now. Work must be provided for the unemployed. It seems clear that a CWA type program with the federal government as the employer of last resort is needed in today's economic climate. But again, gender and racial equality must be ensured. In 1935, Hopkins lobbied vigorously for a permanent jobs assurance corporation that would allow any unemployed and destitute worker to apply for federally subsidized jobs. He insisted that the opportunity to work for a living was an inalienable right for all Americans and that government jobs should be a part of any social insurance package. President Roosevelt deplored direct relief, what he called the dole, and he said it caused a continued dependence on relief, induces a spiritual and mental disintegration, fundamentally destructive to the national fiber. To dole out relief in this way is to administer a narcotic, a subtle destroyer of the human spirit. It is in violation of the traditions of America. Work must be found for the able-bodied but destitute workers. FDR urged Congress to appropriate an initial $4 billion to provide jobs for those on relief. The Emergency Appropriation Act created the Works Progress Administration, the WPA, as an alternative to Hopkins' plan for a permanent federal jobs program. The WPA, under Hopkins' direction, undertook 250,000 projects, including everything from building airport runways to providing school lunches, from mosquito control to planting trees. Over the course of 7 years, it spent a total of $10.7 billion, and 86% of this ended up in workers' pockets. Federal One, part of the WPA, provided wages for people in the arts and contributed mightily to our culture. The WPA jobs were labor intensive and during its existence employed 1/5 of the nation's workforce. It demonstrated that subsidized jobs do more than just provide needed work. Such projects greatly improved the landscape of America. Every dollar spent was returned in projects completed. Even more important, it raised the spirits of all who participated. While the enacting legislation made it clear that African Americans were to be given equal access to WPA jobs, local control often prevented this from happening. While there was a women's and professional division of the WPA and women found many administrative positions in FDR's New Deal, women clearly did not participate equally in WPA projects. and this must be addressed in any 21st century jobs program. Thank you. And now I'm going to stop share, and Indy, you're on.
Thank you, June. I hope folks can hear me all right. I can't see my microphone volume level, but just nod if you can't. So first, I'm starting with this slide on the broad benefits of subsidized employment programs. But let me just say, for starters, to my knowledge, every evaluated, sort of documented subsidized employment program in history has increased earnings for participants during the program, and has, in my judgment, clearly demonstrated what David underscored at the beginning with one of his PLS slides on measures of unemployment and underemployment, which is that when you make jobs available, people will seek them and will work in them. And that's actually kind of a big deal. And I would say that on that ground alone, there's a strong case to be made for subsidized jobs. And then I'm going to talk a little about sort of longer term effects that we've seen as well. And by the way, I should say that when you look at these programs, dozens and dozens of them over the last half century or so, nearly half of them, again, that are documented and with some real evidence, have shown that there's some initial, at least sort of lasting effect, not necessarily for years out, but on labor market outcomes and specifically on earnings, we often see. But the thing about subsidized jobs, it reminds me a lot of the conversation around early childhood care and education too. We also have some proof points of some powerful, potentially longer term effects and wider reaching effects. So I'm not saying that this is the grounds on which we should necessarily evaluate these programs, but there's lots of evidence that they can improve even school outcomes for children and families where a subsidized job participant lives, and that they can lower criminal legal system involvement and longer term poverty. These are some of the best programs. One, David was, sort of dreamed up in some ways, the New Hope project back in the mid-90s in Milwaukee. But we see this in dozens of other programs, including very recent evidence from HHS and DOL's evaluations of programs, more than a dozen programs. One of the things that stays with me from that recent evaluation is from MDRC, which is that they found that improvements in employment, earnings, and recidivism were typically concentrated among people who are less employable, which is, I think, quite striking because, of course, there are a lot of people for whom they're not able to work. But for people who are, even with intense barriers in the labor market, including structural barriers like widespread discrimination, subsidized jobs likely can be quite helpful. Now, the programs vary considerably, and I'll talk in a second about some of the proposals out there, but I want to highlight two examples of sort of current recent subsidized jobs programs that were evaluated and found to have, in these cases, durable effects. And just tell you what they kind of look like. These are all on a smaller scale than what June was just talking about, to be sure. But we do have some examples since really in the last 40 years or so, where programs have been on larger scale, nothing quite like what we had as part of the response to the Great Depression, but nevertheless, there's good reason to believe that we have the wherewithal between civil society and the federal government even today. But so the first program I want to talk a little about is Recycle Force in Indianapolis. And what they did is they sought out individuals who had been formerly incarcerated. You see this frequently, knowing the challenges folks who have been formerly incarcerated face in the labor market, and then place them at one of three social enterprises. So there are a lot of social enterprises that overlap with subsidized jobs. And in just one example was in an electronics recycling plant. And during the program, the workers receive training. They receive supervision, case management, job development. So obviously there are folks who actually create these placements for the workers, and assistance with finances and child support. And some folks even had mentors as well, who also had graduated from the program. And this program was found to be cost beneficial. Again, not necessarily the standard that a program needs to meet, but resulted in some significant impacts on earnings, employment, recidivism, even 2.5 years later in the end of the sort of follow-up period for the evaluation. Another program, Transition San Francisco, it also happened to target non-custodial parents. And they began with an assessment of sort of skills and readiness, 2 weeks of job readiness training and then placed participants in one of 3 buckets of subsidized jobs, depending on where they came out from the assessment and training. Nonprofit jobs, typically Goodwill, public sector jobs, and in some cases even for-profit entities. And some participants also receive some modest financial incentives for participation milestones and child support assistance. And here, again, you found some significant improvements. And after the program, some of these were sustained and inevitably some fade out. But you also particularly see here large increases in percentage of participants who pay child support. I like to lift up some of these examples because of the holistic nature of these strategies and the fact that they can have far-reaching benefits throughout a family and a family system. Now, when you hear these, you think about all the different design questions that policymakers and program administrators have to answer when it comes to subsidized jobs programs. And I'm just going to run through some of those. And the first one, of course, eligibility. June described some pretty open-ended eligibility schemes, nearly a century ago. You don't see that so often now. Typically, people are eligible by meeting a number of criteria, but they're not necessarily enormously strict or require enormous documentation. But these are obviously key questions for policymakers. And of course, the program benefits, the variability is extraordinary. One of the things that you see, I think, somewhat increasingly is that it's far more than a job being offered. There's wraparound supports and services, of course, but even then there are questions of the nature of the subsidy and the pay and the duration, which we'll talk about. Sorry, this got a little mixed up here, but on the duration, that's a big question. Policymakers in the proposals I'll touch on in a second typically aim for maximum durations of 6 months. They don't want these jobs to substitute for unsubsidized jobs. Some of our research has suggested that we might experiment with longer durations. Typically, the programs that are the most effective do have longer durations, at least in the 6 to 9 month and longer range, close to 12 months. And typically programs that are 3 months or less, which actually used to be quite common and maybe are still somewhat common, don't have many lasting effects. And of course, the scale. And I think there are trade-offs here that people have to consider. The more you want scale, the less you should be strict on eligibility. And actually eligibility, not just for the workers, but also potentially for employers. And I have in particular pitched that these programs be automatically countercyclical, that the federal government ramp them up as economic conditions deteriorate in particular. And then financing. Our focus has primarily been on largely federally financed programs. And that said, there have been a lot of locally financed, at least partially locally financed and state finance programs as well. And then finally, we touch on this, but the type of work can be quite consequential, both in reaching scale and in potentially aligning, though, workers with things that they might want to pursue as a career. And of course, administrative questions are certainly relevant for any policymaking. Now, before I show the next slide, I just want to make the broad point that there has been a burst of activity around subsidized jobs in 2 broad senses in Congress. One is embedding subsidized jobs as part of larger strategies. And the other is large, ambitious, subsidized jobs focused proposals. And we've seen them targeting a wide swath of working age adults. We've seen them targeting youth. We've seen them targeting public health work that's needed. We've seen them really focus on the job preparation and experience side of things. We've seen them really focus on essentially acting almost as a public employment option, as June sort of described earlier. And these are just a few in the last few Congresses. The first one, the Jobs-Defined COVID-19 Act, is particularly focused on public health and transferring money to state and local governments to help hire, train, and deploy newly unemployed workers. I'll really flag the Jobs for Economic Recovery Act because it also marks an important moment where lead sponsors of numerous prior subsidized jobs bills, including Senator Tammy Baldwin, Senator Chris Van Hollen, Senator Ron Wyden, and really a dozen or more others, Senator Booker, have all sort of come together to unite around this proposal. And I think it's something that you'll see a big push for in the second reconciliation package this year. Historically, these programs have had bipartisan support. When there was a large subsidized jobs component of the TANF Emergency Fund in the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act in 2009, one of the biggest champions was Haley Barbour, Republican governor of Mississippi, former RNC chair. And Republicans at the Ways and Means Committee have at times actually tried to advance more funding for subsidized jobs, typically through the TANF program. So, you'll see here TANF is often a vehicle as well, although I think there's a lot of agreement that TANF has numerous shortcomings, including that would limit the reach and effectiveness of these sorts of programs. And finally, the biggest, I think, of all of these, before I turn things back over to David, is the Job Opportunities for All Act by Representative Ro Khanna. Back of the envelope calculations suggested in a tight labor market, we were talking about $100 billion a year in job spending, in job creation, primarily working through states as well as through competitive grants when states wouldn't sort of participate. As we know, unless the federal government sort of fully funds something, the Supreme Court's going to likely make that program optional for states to participate in. So there were some workarounds, including competitive grants to localities and community-based organizations, prioritizing those where states wouldn't necessarily participate. I think that's particularly important from a racial equity perspective. What we've seen when you give states enormous flexibility in programs like TANF and even now unemployment insurance is you're going to see highly racially inequitable outcomes. So you have to have some strategy of working around that. And you can either be heavy-handed at the federal government level, which can make a lot of sense in many instances, or you can find ways to deliver the benefits and services through other means. For example, the experience of Head Start would sort of bypass the states. Anyway, I'll look forward to taking more questions, but I'm going to stop screen share and turn it back to David.
Well, thank you. And we're pretty much at the point where we wanted to deal with questions. What I wanted to do first is thank Indy and also thank June for their presentation. And also wanted to thank the staff, Jay Patel and Tom Novotny, for getting us to this point. I wanted to show just one more real slide before we give you our names and some contact information. We've talked about the job shortage. We've talked about past and current experience with subsidized employment and the effectiveness of those programs. This slide, which I didn't put in the original version, is from a Carnegie Corporation Gallup poll, where they asked Americans, do you support a government jobs program for those who've lost their jobs? And as you can see, the support for such a program, without a lot of the details spelled out, is overwhelming. Democrats and Republicans, the population as a whole. So one of the questions that we hope to discuss with you, and I see we've already got one in the chat, and I'd request that others who do have questions put their questions in the chat. But one of the questions that we have to grapple with is, how do we translate this evidence of past effectiveness, current effectiveness, public support, how do we translate that into arguments and strategies that persuade the general public, press, think tanks, academicians, and above all, federal policymakers to actually turn these bills, these proposals, into legislation that gets turned into law and eventually gets turned into real jobs for real people. Howard Fleur has sent in 2 questions, which I'd like to take a quick stab at answering, and then ask Indy and June if they'd also like to. 2-part question. How could the pre-COVID mismatch of open job seekers and open jobs get addressed through these programs? One of the advantages of the Jobs for Economic Recovery Act and some of the other programs is that even though they are primarily designed to deal with the massive unemployment we face now, they also are meant to be permanent. And so after the pandemic is over, after most people are absorbed in the private sector, there still are going to be parts of the country and certain groups that face difficulties, not just with skills, not just with having a criminal background record or childcare, but literally with a shortage of jobs in the places they live, central cities, certain rural areas. You can think of, West Virginia is in the discussion a lot these days. They just don't have enough jobs in West Virginia, and not because of government policy on coal. It's just what's happening there. So to have a program that can expand and contract countercyclically to deal with broad scale recessions when needed, and also deal with pockets of unemployment or certain individuals or groups that need help. This was Harry Hopkins' original vision, and I think it's a good one today. Howard also asked about the name. Those of us who've been in the field have gone around and around as to what name to use. Initially, these were called community service jobs. Then the expression transitional jobs was chosen. Each of those had a problem. Community service implied that they would be working only for government. Well, that didn't suit some people. Transitional implied that everybody would get a job in the private sector. That these jobs are only for the transition of individuals from a subsidy to a non-subsidized position. That's not realistic for a lot of people or a lot of areas. So subsidized employment, I've noticed in recent months, has become the most commonly used expression. But you're right, it's not, maybe we can have suggestions in the chat box as to alternative names that have the fewest liabilities and would be most popular. Let me see if June or Indy want to comment on Howard's question, and also please put in the chat box any other comments or questions that you have.
Go ahead, Indy, you had your hand up.
Well, I agree with what was said there. I'd love a contest to come up with the better terminology here, Howard. Something we've struggled with. The thing I wanted to sort of talk about in thinking about how these jobs sort of fit into the landscape is, and the mismatch in skills that's always kind of there is, I really think about a broad framework of job creation, and you could say preservation when there's a recession, quality and preparation, all going hand in hand. And in particular, to have enough sort of quality jobs that people could, prepare to do, you obviously need certain macro policy, including and certain sort of monetary policy, arguably trade policy, but and sort of exchange rate policy. But we really focus on the fiscal side of things, where I think you can have a lot of influence. And if we know we need a lot of jobs, for example, as we do in the care economy, where we're just not producing enough jobs relative to the need, and the jobs are of low quality, other rich countries deal with the struggle too, and the answer is always some sort of public investment. The right thing in my mind would be to sort of directly create those jobs, by and large, as sort of standard jobs. But of course, there'll be some people who, at the margin, if you go through and sort of create all the jobs to meet your national needs that aren't being met by the sort of current economic system, there are some people who still won't get one of those jobs. And there are programs like the AFDC, Home Health Aid Homemaker, subsidized job program from the 1970s that help people disproportionately women of color actually get a foothold into some of these occupations that didn't necessarily require a lot of credentials right off the bat to get started. And so subsidized jobs can sort of help with that. And then, I think that's one way to think about addressing the sort of skills mismatch, like making the direct issue by issue investment, like energy conservation, climate care, et cetera, and then using subsidized jobs to help at the margin. And another is, of course, to think about the fact that there's just always some work to be done. And if we're willing as a society to transfer money to people, which we're not always, but we should be, to help them have just a minimum standard, we could instead, in some cases, do it as part-time work, maybe something less than full-time, people with certain disabilities, temporary, partial, et cetera. And then it's more about aligning needs to the work, sort of national needs to the work again. So like imagine public employment work, cleaning parks or something like that, rather than per se about, skills development. So anyway, I'll stop there and turn it over to June, but hope that helps.
I agree with everything you say, Indy. It has to be a federally planned program with state and local assistance to get people ready for a subsidized job. May have to be on the state or local level, but it's clear that the federal government is going to have to take the lead here. It can't be left to the states. And I think that's an important point. I'm going to stop here because I think Nancy Altman had a question.
I'd like to get to Nancy's question, but June, while you've got the floor, we also have a question from David Nexon.
Okay.
Came in first. What was the role of the private sector in the WPA? When the WPA built a road, did they hire private contractors who managed the workers, or were all the workers federal employees? If subcontractors were used, were the workers federal employees, or was there a mix? So if you could talk about that.
They were all federal employees, and that was the important point that Hopkins insisted on, that there will be. Now, there was certainly some help from the local organizations, but these were federal jobs. So there was no private part in their in creating these jobs or directing the jobs. It was a federal government. Now, certainly that they had WPA offices in the states and in cities, but the federal government held the strings, and that was an important part of it. And no social workers. That's what Hopkins, an ex-social worker, said no social workers. Yeah.
I'm going to take a first crack at Nancy Altman's question. She says the next reconciliation package seems like an ideal place for a jobs program. Agree with that 100%. If I were talking to the president, what would I propose to be included to get a majority in the Senate? I've thought a lot about that. One thing, obviously, is it's going to be necessary probably to make some technical fixes in the bill to be sure that the deficit window doesn't exceed what's required in the Byrd Rule and some stuff like that. But I think that there are a couple of things that are more important politically. This is my view. One of which is that I believe that for the first couple of years at least, it should be 100% federal funding. We're getting a mixed picture about whether or not states, which are the entities to play a lead role, certainly in the Jobs for Economic Recovery Act, in many of the other bills, do they have deficits as bad as was being talked about earlier, or are they in much better shape than we think? But the bottom line is, and I'm speaking in this capacity as a former state budget director for the state of Wisconsin, even in a blue state, I would imagine, certainly in a red state, a red legislative state like ours, that the appetite for adding even a small state match to draw down massive federal funds is going to be pretty limited. So if I were the federal government passing a jobs bill, I would say it's free for the first year, the second year, the third year, similar to what was done with the Obamacare Medicaid expansion. And then, even then, still have a very high enhanced match rate that says even after it stops being free, you're going to get a much higher reimbursement for your costs than under regular Medicaid. So that's one thing that I'd urge President Biden to urge to the sponsors of the legislation. if this program is put out there, but nobody comes to the table and sits down and has dinner, what good will it do? And it'll look bad. The second thing I would do, Nancy and everybody, I think that at least part of it should be, I don't want to say carved out, but should be designated for particular groups or causes that are very popular. So one, President Biden has already said, he's proposed a civilian climate corps. He said, however, that it's going to be funded with, quote, within existing appropriations. Well, you know, there just ain't a lot of money to build anything close to the CCC in terms of numbers. So the Jobs for Economic Recovery Act, or any of the bills that Indy listed, could say 30% of the money or X number of billions of dollars shall be for the purpose of funding and expanding the civilian climate corps. Well, that would appeal, I would hope, to President Biden and the other advocates in Congress who favor conservation. I also, in connection with that, I would say some of the money, or a percent of it, should be to help people in the fossil fuel industry who lose their jobs. This is partly just politics. It would be a great thing to say to Senator Manchin and, you know, Senator Tester in Montana. We've got your back on this. We understand that there are people in your state who don't like, you know, wind energy, don't like solar, or in any case, they're worried. What about them when climate change puts them out of work? That's going to happen anyway. But why not say, we recognize your special problem, and we're going to have a transition. This is where transition comes in as a good word. We're going to help you transition from being unemployed or doing, you know, not the greatest work, to new jobs in this program that then help you move on later. And then finally, I would tie a lot of it to health and infrastructure. Contact tracing will diminish in time, but we have lead issues in our water in Flint, Michigan. We have lead issues in the homes in the central city of Milwaukee. There's a lot of public health issues. Public health is pretty popular these days. That would be something. And then infrastructure. You know, infrastructure's, everybody loves infrastructure, except when you get down to specifics. I love filling potholes. I'm not so keen on building new roads, widening roads, ramming more lanes of concrete through central city areas that promote racial and economic segregation and do damage to the environment. So that's not my favorite infrastructure, but all the other stuff, broadband and fixing up parks and filling potholes, you know, that you don't have to get too specific. So I would try to say to the president, a lot of the things you want and Congress wants, and a lot of the political problems you have will be solved by crafting language, perhaps either in the bill itself or in the presentation of the bill. Indy, June, on that question?
Well, I'll just briefly add that, first of all, Nancy, great to hear from you. Great question. I think that, again, in many ways, the proposals out there, like the Jobs for Economic Recovery Act, which I'll drop some information on, should be widely acceptable across the ideological spectrum. The challenge, so enough to get majorities. The challenge is usually just the cost. What happened, for example, when the Ways and Means Republicans tried to move a discussion candidate draft that included an expansion of subsidized jobs several years ago, they cut other funding for people with low incomes at the same time. So, you know, that's going to be challenged. Presumably, you know, they're going to try to offset future non-emergency legislation. But I think that we can absolutely expect that there'll be sort of attractive ideas there. In contrast to, you know, 80, 90 years ago, we're probably going to have to allow private employers. So that's probably something that's necessary to get a majority. The truth is, private employers don't participate necessarily at high rates, especially outside of weak labor markets. And we would probably want to have some caps that we could get through on a bipartisan basis on the size of the employer. Now, I have sort of made the point that this is not a critique of the particular employer here, but you wouldn't want this program to be used as a huge part of like Walmart's employment strategy. I think that would be politically fatal to the program. So you do have to think about those sorts of realities in optics. I'll let maybe June, you want to say something about this and Howard's question.
There's always a question of cost, and I know that's, people are talking about that, but the federal government can afford it. I mean, it's the states can't, but the federal government can, and it can somehow get the money. I mean, it's the idea that, and David showed very clearly that there'll never be enough jobs to absorb everybody who wants a job. And therefore the government needs to be, the federal government needs to be the employer of last resort. And it can do that. As for asking for money from the states to get federal money, the FERA had a 4-to-1 requirement, but that ended really quickly because it couldn't happen. But it was all federal money. If we had spent more money in 2008, 9, 10, we would have gotten out of the recession a lot faster, I think. I think that's sort of the general attitude now. It's the idea that money needs to be infused into a economy that is flagging, and that's pure Keynesian, but it does work. And if you work from the bottom up rather than the top down, we don't want Walmart to be involved in this. We want the ordinary worker who is out of a job. Now there may be some training programs that we have to include in this, especially when these jobs end. We don't want people who have gotten a federally subsidized job to be floating around, again, unemployed. So the other end needs to be decided as well. But it's going to be up to the federal government to do this, probably in cooperation with state organizations and local organizations, because the localities know what is needed in their area, what kind of jobs can be created and what kind of people are needed to work. So it has to be a cooperative effort. So, and that Gallup poll was remarkable. I don't know if you can put that up, but the fact that an overwhelming number of Americans, Democratic and Republicans, favor a federally subsidized job program. I was surprised at that. I don't know if anybody else was, but I was pleasantly surprised at that. Yeah.
We're getting near the end. There are a couple of questions in the chat, but I want to be respectful of time limits. I'm willing, and I don't want to speak for June and Indy, to stay on longer, but those of you who want to go back to the main program, we don't want to discourage that. I put up on the screen that Carnegie Corporation Gallup poll. It's a wonderful document to look at because it's got lots of other good information. So I'd encourage people to look at it. It's called Listening Back to Work, Listening to Americans. Here's my information as well as June's and Indy's if you want to follow up with us. I'll leave this on the screen as we begin to wrap up. In terms of some of the chat questions that were asked, I think, Indy, you've looked at them. June, do you want to respond to any of them?
No, I think we've done it.
Okay. There were a couple that I'm going to get rid of this and go back to our main screen. I did see a question that David Podoff asked about incentives and opportunities for disabled workers. Several other workshops and sessions have talked about that. One idea I have, and I'll just put this out here, maybe no one will agree with it, but it does seem to me that in our disability program and in our unemployment insurance program, the idea of letting people voluntarily choose to get the money they're entitled to in the form of a wage and then revert back to a cash grant if the job doesn't work out, and then finding ways for them to work would be worth exploring. And one of the reasons for that goes back to an issue that June raised earlier. In the Great Depression, they went back and forth between the payment being a grant that you worked off versus a real wage versus what people thought was a wage, but it really quite wasn't. And of course, BLS had trouble labeling people as employees, partly for some of those reasons, although not entirely. These days, there's overwhelming benefit for people to be real employees getting a wage. One of them is that they can get the earned income tax credit. To the extent the child tax credit remains based on earnings or income, there's a reason to have that count. The EITC is the biggest, since many of these workers will have dependent children. Another argument, of course, is that they're paying taxes, they're paying FICA, they're paying Medicare. That reduces their net income in the short run. To the extent that we have advanced periodic payment of the child tax credit and EITC, that's offset. But it helps, it helps to a limited extent to put more funds into the Social Security and Medicare trust funds, which is a good thing. And more importantly, it helps build up people's quarters and credits for Social Security eligibility and benefits. So there are multiple reasons for these days treating people as employees being paid a wage. I know some of the proposals talk about giving people a stipend, particularly while they're doing part-time training. That's worth considering. But again, you don't get the EITC based on a stipend. So we should think carefully about that.
Can I just interject on that since I asked the question? I worked on Ticket to Work when I worked for Senator Moynihan, and I was on the Social Security Advisory Board, and we did all sorts of things to try to get people back into the workforce from off the disability world. So I just wanted to throw that out. When you're talking about supported work, we ought to be working to make sure that there's some opportunities for people who, as you say, want to trade their stipend or their Social Security benefit for some sort of work program. I think that we should just make sure we do something, include them in the possibilities of supported work.
One way to address both that issue and another set of issues is to be sure that physically subsidized employment is very conveniently accessible to people. This was a bit less of an issue, I think, back in the New Deal era, because urban areas were more concentrated, mass transit systems, for all of their clunkiness back then, were more frequent. These days, if you have a subsidized employment job, but it's on the other side of town and there's no transit to get to it, and you have a car, but it's on cinder blocks in the backyard, what good is it going to do you? So having subsidized employment be, very convenient in the church or the church basement, around the corner, in a daycare center, in a school, just so that anybody can get there. And then for persons with disability, as well as for people who can't really leave their kids at home 40 hours a week, or people who need to attend a meeting at their school for a parent-teacher conference, just to minimize the complexity of getting to the job, getting back from the job. So I think that would help persons with a disability.
Yep.
It would help people who have, if you will, handicaps in the old-fashioned word, the generic sense of the word in general, just difficulty getting to work. And frankly, a lot of the New Deal programs, the WPA programs, did involve particularly women going to schools, preparing materials. They were not the great post office murals that we love that lasted forever, or the movie version of Orson Welles' famous movies. They were things that were cut out of cloth or cut with scissors and handed over to school children, and they disappeared quickly. They're not in museums, but they were of great value.
Yes, David, that is really important, because I've heard frustrations from people saying how difficult it is to go to the unemployment office to sign up for this, or how to get TANF. I mean, that has to be made easier. There's really a high level of frustration for people who are already frustrated about not working. And one of the things that I don't think has been paid enough attention to, during the Great Depression, there was an economic depression, but there was also a psychological depression. And during these pandemic years, you hear a lot about mental health and about people. I mean, the suicide rate's up. There's no question about that. So the idea of putting people in a job, getting them some security, at least letting them know that there is something there that they can turn to for help, I think is a really important part of any jobs program. It's a way to encourage people a way to lift their spirits. The idea of a job waiting for them and a wage. And as David said, the idea that, you're going to pay into FICA, you're going to get Social Security, you're going to get all these benefits of working, other than the emotional uplift. And I think that's something that is important to keep in mind.
I'm looking at Jay. Jay, have we reached our appointed hour for wrapping up? I was going to offer Indy one last chance to.
No, you can keep, as long as questions are flowing and there's conversation going, you can keep talking because we don't have any more events for the conference for the rest of the day.
Okay. I had one thing that I hadn't put in our PowerPoint, but I want to take the liberty of sharing it with people. This is hopefully people can see this. Okay. So let's see here. Let me get this to work. Okay, can people see this?
Yes.
Okay. Several years ago, my organization commissioned the Urban Institute to do an analysis of the impact of different work-based policies on reducing poverty. We've been talking about the first two of the blue bars on the left. TJ's, transitional jobs, is what we called subsidized employment back then. And what they did was they modeled what would happen if wage-paying subsidized employment was available to any adult in the United States between, I think, 18 and 65, paying what turned out to be, we modeled an enhanced minimum wage. What would the impact of that be on reducing poverty using the supplemental poverty measure? And as you can see from this slide, and I think I actually have an earlier slide, transitional jobs alone had a pretty powerful impact. And by the way, they had a disproportionately beneficial impact on Blacks compared to the general population. So they reduced racial inequity. But you really do need to have a package, what the Academy calls a portfolio of policies. And so what we did was we modeled each of the impacts of a minimum wage increase, a bigger EITC, and then a de facto higher payment for people getting disability benefits or getting Social Security. And each one of them alone produced a substantial reduction in poverty. But what's remarkable is that even with that when you put them all together, you get just dramatic reductions, 50%. I think the blue bar on the far right is 58% reduction. These policies tend to reinforce each other. So when an unemployed worker gets a transitional job and perhaps gets paid at least the higher minimum wage and gets a bigger earned income tax credit and doesn't have to worry about the cost of childcare as much, the cumulative effect of all of that. Now, we were fairly modest in some of the things we proposed here. I think we modeled a $10 or $12 minimum wage, not 15. We didn't include a child tax credit increase and so on. So you could get to 60, 70% reduction in poverty by packaging these things together. We didn't include paid leave. There are a number of things. We didn't include the impact, if you can measure it, of stronger collective bargaining. So I just mentioned this because standing alone, my belief is that subsidized employment, transitional jobs, whatever we want to more appropriately label it, is very beneficial in providing earnings to people, in dealing with the psychological problems that June talked about, the social problems of isolation and stigma. But when you put it together with all these other things, you really have a dramatic impact. And this goes back to Nancy's question about the Biden administration. They're doing a lot of the things that are on here already. Proposal to get a higher minimum wage, EITC reform, child tax credit, paid leave. There is a proposal to raise the minimum benefit for disability benefits and Social Security. The one piece that's missing with any level of specificity is subsidized employment. But you can see how it interacts so positively with all these other things. Okay, any more questions that we've overlooked? Shall we call it a day?
I just had one comment. and I observed this from my experience at the Committee for Economic Development. I think it's a mistake to refer to this as a recession. It's a once in 100-year event related to the pandemic and then all the consequences. But I think too many policymakers and economists are treating it as if it's a conventional, and it is not a conventional recession at all. So therefore, the cures have to be different and the state of mind has to be different.
Well, I think that's right. I mean, in the same way that the Great Depression exposed the fundamental fault lines in the, in the economic system and government's lack of adequate policies to fill those gaps and correct those flaws, this, whatever you want to call it, second Great Recession or second Great Depression or whatever, is exposing fundamental faults in the system. I mean,
It's also,
that's
I mean, I would just add, David, and Howard, there's also a narrower sense in which it's important not to fixate just on the recession per se. And that's just how long after a recession ends, people are facing terrible labor market prospects. Partly, a lot of folks are facing recessionary labor market prospects, even when the country's technically expanding or way into an expansion, with the African American unemployment rate routinely double that of whites, as we know. But it took us over 7 years to close the jobs gap after the last recession. And while Congress, responded earlier this time, the scale of the problem is so much bigger that I'm going to worry no matter what, but I'll be far more worried if there's some version of the large stimulus under consideration now doesn't get passed. And I think that we try to talk about just a weak labor market, but Howard, you make a broader sort of, I think point about how we should even conceptualize what we're dealing with. And I've often seen comparisons to it as being like a wartime situation. And that's, putting aside my lack of militancy, that's an attractive analogy to some extent, that, you do what it takes when it's a war, right? Like you don't say, oh, we can't do, talked about, of course we can afford this, right? You sort of find a way to do what it takes.
It's
having read the latest biography of John Maynard Keynes last year, it reinforces that. And for example, also that Second World War, FDR didn't say to each governor, "Okay, we're at war. It's up to you. Go do what you have to do to fight the Germans."
It's worth noting that when in the quote that I started off with, where FDR in his inaugural address said that our primary task is to put people to work. The next sentence in that speech is, we should treat the crisis as we would treat a war. I mean, he explicitly connected massive unemployment, need to tackle it, treat it like it was a war. So they got it back then. We need to get it now.
That war analogy was really very effective. It gave him extraordinary executive power. And that's what he needed then. And he convinced the people to do that, to give him that power. Get the Congress. But he also had Congress behind him too. That's the other if.
The other thing, and this goes also back to Nancy's question about if we were talking to President Biden, what would we say? As we all know, usually in midterm elections, the party in power loses seats in Congress. One of the rare exceptions was 1934, where I believe in part because Roosevelt and Congress acted quickly to tackle the Great Depression, put people to work, and did it in visible ways. I mean, people saw kids going off to CCC camps. They saw in the winter of 33, 34, 4 million people working on those CWA projects, many of which still survive. If you ever go to San Francisco, the murals in Coit Tower were painted by CWA artists. People saw that, They, of course, also saw that banks weren't failing anymore, other things not having to do with these jobs programs, but immediately producing visible outcomes, I believe, was a reason why in 1934, Franklin Roosevelt gained some seats in the House and 9 seats in the Senate. And that liberated him from needing to depend upon as many Southern conservatives in terms of achieving all the great things that happened in that miracle year of 1935, where between May of 1935 and August of 1935, we got unemployment insurance, Social Security, and the Wagner Act, and probably lots of other stuff, and lay the groundwork for a couple years later, the last sort of major act of the New Deal, the Fair Labor Standards Act. So, Mr. President, do something big that puts people to work, and maybe it'll actually produce positive political effects. There'll be all kinds of yelling and screaming and complaining about it. Although ironically, this is written about in the wonderful biography of Roosevelt and Harry Hopkins by Robert Sherwood. One of the persons who rejected the president, FDR had to shut down the CWA, as June has explained, in the spring of 1934, the Civil Works Administration. One of the persons that strenuously objected to that was the then governor of Kansas, Alf Landon. So he basically said, all the rest of what you're doing is bad, but the CWA was good, which brings us back to a point Indy raised, which is that in the same way that Haley Barbour, I think it was you that mentioned this, Indy, was a strong supporter of transitional jobs programs during the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act. And in my own state of Wisconsin, Governor Scott Walker, who had initially proposed to eliminate the small subsidized employment program created in the administration of Governor Doyle, a Democrat, passed by a Democratic legislature, he took over, Republicans took over the legislature. He proposed to eliminate the program, realized it was good, and went back to the key committee of the legislature and said, essentially, I made a mistake. Please keep the transitional jobs program going. It's a good program. It was about the only thing that he changed course on in the course of that budget. But again, because it connected work to people getting money, it was easier for him as a conservative Republican to swallow. And actually, in that Carnegie Foundation report, this talks about how the reasons why Democrats support jobs are somewhat different than the reasons why Republicans do. For Democrats, it's more, we got to help people. A lot of people get help by working, so let's have jobs for people. A lot of Republicans support it because, well, the way people should be taken care of is by being self-sufficient. And yeah, we recognize that getting a job is tough, so let's sort of make them work, if you will. There's a kind of I don't want to call it punitive, but it's like it comports more with values on that side of the spectrum to maybe a greater extent than on the left. But the bottom line is, who cares what the motives are for people?
To simplify this, David, sorry to interrupt, but it seems to me that there's a carrot and stick here, where the Democrats use jobs as a carrot and the Republicans use jobs as a stick, sort of a punishment. And I think the idea of jobs being a carrot was the spirit of the New Deal, that this is what we're giving you, not what we're making you do.
And that can produce terrible consequences when we say, we're going to take away your health care, we're going to take away your food stamps, we're going to take away your housing benefits, unless you look for a job and prove it. That's terrible. And particularly for people who truly have a disability but haven't yet gotten on SSI or SSDI, it's particularly punishing. On the other hand, what a job is you must work in order to get paid. We can call that a stick, we can call it a norm, we can call it whatever, but that's what work is. Work is doing something that somebody else wants you to do, not necessarily you want to do, and in return you get paid this thing called a wage, this thing called earnings for it. So, is it punitive? Yeah, I mean, all of us have been punished. All of us on this call have been punished, therefore, for most of our lives, the jobs we've been in. But I don't think most of us have thought of it as punishment.
No, no, we haven't indeed. We've been very lucky to be working in jobs that we love and have passion about. So I think that in order to give people time to respect their time and move on, we'll have to end this conversation, which was really wonderful and stellar. Thank you, David and Indy and June, for your time, and everybody else that's on the call. It's great to see you all. And please let us know through your feedback that you'll get today suggestions for going into the future of our campaign for economic security, which is expected to last over a couple of years. So we look forward to taking things we've learned over these 2 or 3 days and taking them into the future for advocating and change and making work more meaningful for everybody and rewarding. So thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank
Barbara.
you.
Thanks, Jay.
Thanks,
and
everyone.
everybody.
Thanks,
David.
Brian.
Bye.
Bye.